Welcome to part 9 of this YSL tutorial series on Excel VBA user forms. This short video is going to talk to you about how to use spin buttons. So we're going to talk to you first of all about how to draw the spin button on the form and how you can set its minimum, maximum and default values. We'll then show you how you can display the value contained in the spin button because by default it doesn't have a way to display that value. We'll talk about synchronizing the spin button's value with a corresponding text box, so changing the spin button will change the value in the text box and vice versa. And then towards the end we'll have a slightly more complex example using a spin button to control a colour gradient. So a few things to do here, let's get started. Okay, so to demonstrate the basics of how spin buttons work, I've added another column to our list of film data, which stores the film's runtime in minutes, and we're going to add a spin button control to the form that allows the user to enter this value. So back into the Visual Basic editor, and we're going to go to our form. We need to create a little bit more space. We're rapidly running out of that at this point. We are going to solve this problem at some point soon, actually, create a completely different way to organise the controls on the form. But for now, we're just going to carry on with the frames that we've got. So I'm going to increase the height of that frame a little bit, and then we're going to draw a couple of controls inside that frame. I'm going to have a label first of all, which describes what the value of the control represents. So let's have a label, and I'm going to call this one Film Runtime Label. And then we'll change its caption as well, so that it says something like runtime. Then what we'll do is draw the spin button control. So from the toolbox, you can find the spin button. It looks a little bit like this. Don't get it confused with the scroll bar. So there's the spin button control, second to last one. And if we choose to draw one of those on the form, you'll hopefully spot the immediate problem with the spin button. The spin button really is just the buttons. There's no way to display the actual value that it contains. So what you'll often do when you have a spin button drawn on your form is you'll combine that with a text box or some other control to represent its value. I'm just going to rename the spin button first before I actually add the text box. I'm going to change its name so that it's called Film Runtime. So I'm kind of following the same convention where I'm naming the control for the value that it contains. So I'm going to draw another text box now next door to it, which is going to display the value, and I'm going to call this something simple like Film Runtime Text. Okay, so at that point, those are all the controls done. I could do with a little bit of tidying up and aligning things, but I've shown you how to do that in a previous video, so I don't want to waste too much time doing that right now. So let's get to the point of actually making the spin button work. The spin button itself technically is working already at this point without me doing anything. If I were to run the form and then start clicking up and down on the spin button buttons, the value of the spin button is actually changing. It's just that of course we can't see that represented anywhere. So what we'd like to do is when the value of the spin button changes, we want to update the value of the corresponding text box to reflect the value of the spin button. So to make that work, I'm going to close down the form and head back to its design view, and then double click on the spin button to get the default event of that button, which is the change event. So what we're going to do is change the value of the film runtime text dot value to be equal to film runtime dot value. Having done that, if I now go back to Excel and I launch my form and I start clicking up on the spin button, you'll see that the runtime text box also changes its value to match. Spin buttons have a default value, which you'll spot if you try to increase the value or decrease the value of the spin button. If I try to increase it and update the text box, it increases to the value 1, so the default value of the spin button is actually 0. The spin button has a limited range as well. I can't decrease it below 0, and I can't increase it to more than 100 by default. If you're prepared to wait for a few seconds, you'll see that it'll stop when it reaches 100. So if we wanted to modify any of those values, so the default value of the spin button, and we wanted to change its upper and lower limit, we can change that using the properties, and we can also make sure that the text box displays the default value of the spin button when the form first loads. So let's close down the form and head back to the Visual Basic editor, and we'll deal with setting the default and min and max values of the spin button first. Now it's probably easiest to find these settings if you switch to the categorized view of the properties window with the spin button selected, and then scroll down to the scrolling category. So there you go, you've got the min and the max properties. I think 100 is a little bit too low for runtimes of our films. Let's increase it, let's say up to 1,000. I don't know, maybe we'll get some Peter Jackson films in the list later on, so 1,000 seems like a sensible limit for that. The minimum of 0 is probably a bit too low, but I'm kind of happy with it being 0 for this point in time. There's two other properties here as well. So there's the small change property, which is set to 1. So that basically sets how much the value of the spin button changes when you click the up or the down arrow. So it'll either add or subtract 1. So if you want to change in larger increments, you can change that number. I think for this example, 1 is probably a good choice, but for much larger numbers and for larger ranges, you might want to increase that. The delay property is related to what happens when you hold the mouse button down on the spin button. So that's the time in milliseconds between each subsequent click, if you like, of the spin button. So if I hold the mouse button down, every 50 milliseconds it'll be as if I clicked on the spin button again. There's a small extra delay for the very first repeat. So when you first hold the mouse button down, the first delay is 5 times the value of the delay property. So the first delay is 250 milliseconds, and then each subsequent one is 50 milliseconds. If that's too short or too long, then you can happily change that value there as well. The other thing that we wanted to do here as well was set the default value of the spin button, and also to update the text box to represent that when the form first loads. So we could change the spin button's default value as we could with any other object or control in the form by setting the value property, but it probably makes a bit more sense to do this in code using the form's initialize event. So I'll need to switch to the form's code view, which I can easily do by just double-clicking the background of the form, and that takes me to the initialize event, and I already have some code in here from some previous videos. All I'm going to do is add a couple of extra lines of code that set, first of all, the value of the film runtime spin button. So film runtime.value equals, I'm going to make it equal to 100, say. This seems like a fairly sensible middle ground. What we'll then do is update the value of the film runtime text box. So I'm going to say film runtime text.value, and make that equal to the value of the film runtime spin button. So the next job is just to give that a quick test. If I head back to Excel and then launch my form, this time I find that the runtime text box is 100, as is the value of the spin button. So if I start increasing or decreasing, it will change from that point. One potential problem we have to consider with our linked text box and spin button is that currently they're only synchronized in one direction. If I change the spin button's value by clicking on it, then the value of the text box changes to match that. However, if I did that the opposite way round, if I changed the value of the text box manually, then that does nothing to affect the value of the spin button. So should I subsequently increase or decrease the value of the spin button, that will just use a different value altogether. So it doesn't matter what number I type in here, changing the value of the text box doesn't update the value in the spin button. A really simple solution to this problem would be simply to either disable or lock that text box so that the user can't manually enter a value. So if I close the form down and head back to the design view in the Visual Basic editor, I can select that text box and I can change its enabled property from true to false. And the effect of that is if I go back to the form, if I just run it from the VB editor, I'll see that its value is there, but I can't even click into the text box at this point. But I can still increase and decrease its value using the spin button. Alternatively, what I could do if I close the form down again is I could select the text box again, change its enabled property back to true, and I could change its locked property instead. If I change its locked property to true from false, and then run the form again, I'll find this time again I can change its value using the spin button, and I can click into the text box to select the value. So for instance, if I wanted to copy that, but I can't manually type into the text box. So that's one really simple solution, but it does mean that the user has to rely on clicking the spin button to change the value at all, which can be really, really tedious if there's a long way to go. So it might be nicer just to update the code of the text box and the spin button, so that as well as changing the value of the text box when the spin button changes, we change the value of the spin button when the text box changes. So let's just close the form down again, and then select the text box, and I'm going to change its locked property back to false, and then we'll add a bit more code, this time to the change event of the text box. So I can access the change event of the text box simply by double-clicking on it, and that will generate the change event handler. And the simple line of code we need to write in here is essentially the reverse of what we did with the spin button earlier on. So this time I'm going to say film runtime.value equals film runtime text.value. If we just give this one a quick test by heading back into Excel, show the form on screen, we can increase and decrease the value using the spin button. We can also modify the value of the text box manually and then spin up and down from that point using the spin button. So everything's now synchronized. Now we do have to be slightly careful about using this approach, because it's quite possible for the user to enter any value into the text box, including things that aren't valid to be stored in a spin button's value. So for instance, they could type in some text, or they might type in a number that's outside of the range of the min and the max of the spin button. So if I were to try to do that, let's say I want to increase the value of the runtime to 5010 minutes. If I try to do that, that's outside of the range of the spin button. If I hit the debug button, it shows me that that line has failed. So I can't enter the value 5010 into the spin button. The similar thing would happen if I tried to enter some text into the text box. So what we should do is add a little bit of validation code to make sure that the user can only enter a valid value, and if they enter something that's outside of the range of valid values, then the spin button's value doesn't change. So I'm going to stop running the code there with the reset button, and then let's head back to the code behind the change event of the runtime text box. So there are three conditions that must be met in order for us to update the value of the spin button. First of all, whatever we've typed into the text box must be a number, and that number must be both greater than or equal to the min of the spin button and less than or equal to the max of the spin button. So we can simply use a sequence of if statements to check all those things. So we start by saying if is numeric, film runtime text dot value, and I'm going to write this across multiple different lines, so I'm going to use a space underscore to allow me to continue on the next line. And film runtime rather than flim runtime. Film runtime text dot value is greater than or equal to film runtime dot min, and using another space underscore, film runtime text dot value is less than or equal to film runtime.max. As long as all those conditions are true, then I want to update the value of the film runtime spin button. If any of those conditions aren't met, then what I'm going to do is have an else clause, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change the value of the film runtime text back to the value of the film runtime spin button. So we're going to say film runtime text dot value equals film runtime dot value. Can't stop typing that as flim rather than film, sorry about that. Film runtime.value. Don't forget the end if, and there we go, there's a basic validation done for that, that change event. Let's give this one a quick test back in Excel. We should find, when I show the form on screen, I can happily type in, or first of all I can happily change the value of the spin button and the text box changes. I can happily type in a number that's within a certain range, and that one will work as well. If I try to type in a number that's outside of that range, then it immediately changes back and prevents me from doing so. So it doesn't matter where I type that number in, if it's outside of the range of the min and max. Or if I try to type in some text as well, as soon as I try to type in a text value, that prevents me from changing the value as well. So that means that everything just works neatly, and it's fairly impossible for the end user to mess that up now. One basic thing that we haven't done with the spin button is transferred its value into the worksheet when we click the Add to List button. That's not particularly difficult, but just to prove to you that it's nice and simple, we can add in an extra line of code to our Add Data to List procedure. So we just need to do essentially exactly the same thing that we do to transfer the value of a text box or a comma box. So we can refer to the value of the cell that's 6 columns across, and then refer to film runtime.value. We could refer to the film runtime text box value as well, as they're equal, but I'm going to refer to the spin button's value. So just to give that one a quick test, we can switch back into Excel and we can choose to add in a new film. Guess what? It's going to be Deadpool again. We should be fairly used to the values by now from this series of videos. The release date was 12th of Feb 2016, and then the certificate was 15 in the UK, and we should be able to use our spin button to select the values. I forgot to mention you can use the up and down cursor keys on the keyboard as well to use the spin button. So once it's the active control and once it's got the focus, using the tab key or the shift and tab key, you can use the up and down cursor keys to change its value. I should choose my film genres as well, so let's have action, adventure, comedy. He says he's not a superhero, but I'm gonna include him as a superhero, and then click the Add to List button, and then all of those values will be added in. So there you go, the value of the spin button. It's probably worthwhile just quickly mentioning two extra events of a spin button. We're not going to do a practical example of this, I just want to make you aware that they're here. We've used the change event of the spin button so far, so if I double click the spin button, its default event is change. So whether you change upwards or downwards, then that that event is triggered. There are also two separate events that separate out the spin up and spin down events. So you'll see them if you go to the drop downs at the top right hand corner. You've got a spin down and a spin up. They work in essentially the same way as the change event. It's just that the spin up event is only triggered when you're increasing the value, and spin down is only triggered when you're decreasing the value. So as I said, there's not much of a practical example I can think of here for this form in particular. But should you ever find yourself in the situation where you need to make something different happen when you're increasing the value compared to when you're decreasing the value, you can use spin up and spin down events to achieve that. Okay, just for one last example in this video, we'll come up with a slightly more inventive use for the value stored in a spin button. So rather than just displaying it on a text box and then transferring it into the worksheet, we can also use the value in a spin button to set the value of, well, various other controls as well. So a spin button just contains a number. You can see what's happening here. As I increase the value of the film's runtime, this little bar's increasing in width, and it's also changing in colour as well, so going from bright green all the way through via a couple of murky shades of brown into bright red. So the longer the film, the more red the bar colour becomes. I've slightly shortened the range of values here as well, so I've set the max value down to 300, which seemed like a fairly sensible choice. So the last little part of the video is just going to show you how to create that little system using the value of the spin button to control the properties of other objects. Let's start by changing the max value of our spin button down from 1000 down to about 300. That should be just about enough to handle the length of any film we're going to add to our list. We can always increase it later on if we need to. What we're then going to do is draw a couple of extra labels below the text box which displays the film's length. So let's find the toolbox and add in an extra label which we'll draw just below the text box. I'm going to increase its width so it's about the same width and then just reduce its height ever so slightly. I'm going to change a few of the basic formatting properties here as well. So I'm going to change its name first of all so that it's called max length label. And then I'm going to change its border style from none to a single border. Its back colour is already set to white, which is absolutely fine for this example. I just want to remove the caption as well so it doesn't display any text in there. Okay, so the idea behind that is it's going to sort of form the outline, the container of the bar that increases in width. So to get the bar that increases, what we're going to do again is draw another label, but directly on top of the existing one. So back to the toolbox, I'm going to draw another label, and I'm just going to drop it straight on top of the existing one. I'm going to reduce its height so it's exactly the same height, reduce its width ever so slightly, so maybe it's just around about half the width of the existing one. It doesn't really matter too much because we're going to change the width of this one in code. Again, I'm going to change its name so that it's got a sensible name. I'm going to call this one current length label. I'm going to change its back colour just to make it easier to see while it's in design view. It doesn't really matter because again this is going to be calculated by our code, but just to make it easier to spot. And then I'm going to change its border style again so it's got a single border rather than no border at all. Let's remove its caption as well so it doesn't display any text. And those are the objects we need in order to get this system to work. Now we need to add some more code to the change event of the spin button. So let's double click on that to launch or get into the code view, and we'll add another line of code just below where we're changing the value of the text box next to the spin button. We're also now going to change the width of the current length label. So current length label.width equals, then we're going to calculate its width by saying this. We're going to say we're going to divide the width of the max length label, so we'll say max length label dot width. And we're going to divide that by the maximum value of the spin button. So we're going to say film runtime dot max. Close a parentheses there, and then we simply need to multiply that by the current value of the film runtime spin button. So we're going to say multiplied by film runtime dot value. And that will be enough to calculate the width of the spin button. Calculate the width of the label. So I'm just going to split this across multiple lines so we can see it in one single screen width. There we go. And then we can give this a quick simple test just by heading back to Excel, and we can launch the form, and we should see that the width has already been set automatically when the form was first loaded, because the change event is triggered when we change the value on the initialize event of the form. And as we increase the value of the spin button or decrease it, the width of that label changes automatically as well. So that part's working quite nicely. What we've got to do now is make sure we can get the colour to change from green through to red. So let's close down the form, head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and back to the change event of the spin button. We're going to rely on the RGB function to calculate the colour that the label should be. So just to demonstrate the basic principles of the RGB function, let's change current length label.backColor to be equal to RGB and then open a set of parentheses. So you'll see that there are three parameters, red and green and blue, as integers. Actually, each one of these values can be a number between 0 and 255, and the higher the number, the more of that colour you'll get. So what we need to do is calculate the relevant amount of red and green. We're going to set blue to 0, but blue isn't involved in this colour. We're going to go from green to red. So in a similar way to the way we calculated the proportion of the width of the label, we're going to calculate the proportion of each colour that we need to generate. So before I set the RGB value, let's just set them all to 0, 0, 0. So we'd get black. And then we're going to declare a variable that we can use to hold the value of each individual colour. So I'll declare a simple integer variable at the top of the procedure. So I'll call this one C, something nice and short and easy to reference, C as integer. And then to calculate the value of C, we'll use a similar technique to the way we calculated the width of the current length label. So we'll say C is equal to 255, which is the maximum possible value for any of the red, green and blue components, divided by the maximum possible value of the film runtime spin button, so film runtime.max, and then multiply that by the current value of the film runtime spin button, so film runtime, spell that properly, film runtime.value. All we need to do then is replace the zeros that we entered as placeholders with references to the value stored in C. So the red component is nice and easy. That's just going to be equal to the value of C. So the larger the value of the runtime spin button, the larger the value of C will become as well. The green component needs to work in the opposite direction though. So what we're going to do here is say 255 minus C. So as the value of the runtime increases, the amount of green will decrease. So just to see if that works, let's head back into Excel and we will show the form on screen. And you can see that it's already set to be to sort of the middling green at 100 minutes. Let's just reduce the value down to 1 and then start increasing it using the spin button. So you can see it starts off nice and bright and green, and as the length increases it goes to this sort of murky shade of yellowish brown, and then eventually it'll start becoming more and more red the larger the value becomes. So it's a fairly silly sort of frivolous use for a spin button, but it's just to demonstrate that you don't have to just use a spin button to control a number that gets displayed on screen or entered into the worksheet. Spin buttons can be used to control numbers, and the number of the spin button can be used to control properties of any other object at all. So, hope you've enjoyed that short little video on spin buttons. Join us for the next one where we're going to talk about scroll bars. If you like what you've seen here, why not head over to the WiseL website where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching, see you next time.